Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Back in 2019, our family took a trip to New England, which I think I've mentioned before, and we spent a couple of days in and around the Boston area, primarily touring Revolutionary War sites. One of our first stops was the Boston Tea Party Ship and Museum. It's touristy, as you can tell. Among the photo opportunities is throwing crates of fake tea overboard. They attach a cord so that the next person can do it over again. Kind of cheesy, which may explain why my tossing action looks a little lackluster. Most of us will remember the protests that accompanied the Boston Tea Party. No taxation without representation. Deep in our nation's story is the idea that we should have freedom from something. Freedom from taxation without representation. Freedom from tyranny and kings. Freedom from a far-off power that doesn't understand the everyday needs and desires of people. This still resonates with a lot of us on a variety of levels, but the idea of having freedom from something is incomplete. And the Declaration of Independence, to its credit, understands this, that all of us should have freedom for something as well. And we often remember that phrase that tries to summarize what some of those positive expressions of freedom should be. Life, liberty for its own sake, and for the pursuit of happiness. For understandable reasons, sometimes we focus more on rejecting what we don't want and spend less time trying to positively articulate what it is we're actually seeking. What do we want freedom for? I want to spend some time today reflecting on the biblical idea of freedom and slavery, both the negative and positive expressions of that. Freedom is not just an American idea, but it's been a source of reflection through much of human history, and notably in the history of the Israelites, going back to slavery in Egypt, another historical memory of being subject to another power. Though in the Israelites' case, they suffered through actual slave labor, as some in American history have. Within the American spirit, just as with the human spirit from the beginning, there is a darker inclination toward dominating and enslaving other human beings for personal benefit that we have to wrestle with. In today's reading from Galatians 5, Paul provides a list of things that impinge on freedom, either for ourselves or for our neighbors, as well as those things that we should want to use freedom positively for. To use other language, Paul presents a list of vices and virtues. He begins by urging the Christian community in Galatia to heed this warning. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. What are those forces today in your own life and our collective life that you believe would bind us and limit us? Paul says, for you are called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become enslaved to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But Paul's saying what Jesus says over and over again, and what the Christian movement has articulated throughout its history, is that Jesus has freed us to serve our neighbor. When we're in a state of bondage or slavery to anything, whether it's political power, a a spiritual power like sin or an emotional power like fear, we often end up just turning inward. We resort to self-preservation. We don't have the freedom or the energy to be able to care for others because we're simply fighting for survival. When we're freed, we're given an opportunity to care, to tend to one another, to extend freedom to others. Author and theologian Walter Brueggemann died recently. He's one of the most influential Old Testament scholars of the last several decades. Brueggemann wrote this in a book of devotions entitled, "A Way Other Than Our Own." The truth is that frightened people will never turn the world because they use too much energy on protection of self. It is the vocation of the baptized, the known and named and unafraid, to make the world whole. The unafraid are open to the neighbor, while the frightened are defending themselves from the neighbor. The unafraid are generous in the community, while the frightened in their anxiety must keep in store and accumulate to make themselves safe. The unafraid commit acts of compassion and mercy, while the frightened do not notice those in need. The unafraid are committed to justice for the weak and the poor, while the frightened see them only as threats. The unafraid pray in the morning, care through the day, and rejoice at night in thanks and praise, while the frightened are endlessly restless and dissatisfied. So, dear people, each of you, do not fear. I have called you by name. You are mine. Brueggemann captures what freedom in Christ looks and feels like: freedom from fear and freedom for the neighbor. All of us embody that freedom imperfectly. We're all subject to fear sometimes. And Brueggemann would not have suggested we ignore our fear altogether. It can be instructive. We should notice it and what it's trying to tell us, but not be governed by it and enslaved by it. Otherwise, even legitimate fear, if unchecked, may bring about what we're trying to counteract in the first place. The warnings Paul gives in Galatians against certain behaviors effectively point people away from what will cause a loss of freedom to themselves and others. It's worth mentioning that this is one of a number of passages in which we see Paul drawing from some shared philosophical language from his ancient period of time. It's very similar to the list of vices of the ancient Stoics who dominated the Roman world at that time. No one would have been especially surprised by some of these things he was listing. Stoics commonly used these lists of vices and virtues as a way of educating people and seeking to train people and heal them of improper thinking that led to suffering. For Stoics, knowledge held the potential to free people from their slavery to the passions, as they called them. Passion was seen as an impulse, a movement of the soul which was excessive and contrary to reason. And the goal was to remain unmoved. Passion was seen as irrational and contrary to nature. Often Stoics saw a link between the flesh and passion. Often as Americans, when we hear the term flesh and passion, we tend to focus more exclusively on a sensual type of passion. But the Stoic understanding of passion was so much broader and included mental states that led to enmities, strife, jealousy, fits of rage, quarrels, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, and carousing. I mean, can we see the destructive character of things like factions and fits of rage today? That was actually something that the founders of the U.S. Constitution worried a lot about, enough to set up elaborate checks and balances to counteract factions. Stoics believe that when passions govern us, our own happiness suffers. They can also lead to the harm of others and community, and so paying attention to these vices that can entrap us and focusing instead on virtues which can promote freedom is a way forward. In both lists of vices and virtues, Paul has taken this well-known framework from his day and put a twist on it. In Stoicism, knowledge and truth was the source of virtue, and which ultimately freed us from our captivity. Stoics saw themselves as doctors of the soul, seeking to eliminate ignorance and error. And there's certainly a part of me that would like to believe that simply promoting knowledge and truth would transform people by itself. But I think we're seeing the problem with that. Simply speaking, what's true doesn't seem to always work on its own. It falls on deaf ears or gets rejected all too often. For Paul, the problem wasn't the lack of knowledge, but something deeper: sin. Something only the Spirit could overcome. It's only through the Spirit that we come to live in a new way, embodying not just virtues, but a life of grace. And we're brought into the life of the Spirit by God's gift, not by trying harder. We're claimed as children of God by grace through faith, released from whatever condemnation or doubts that come from outside of us or from within. We're set free to live a new life. It's a life that embodies love for neighbor as the end goal. That's what healthy freedom looks like. It's a freedom turned outward, not inward. Even as we have the freedom to fulfill our own needs and desires, it's ultimately neighbor-serving, not self-serving. This kind of freedom extends grace wherever possible. And yes, at times, boundaries need to be set. Some actions and behaviors are destructive and will undo our freedom. But in the long arc of life, we're renewed and find meaning and purpose in love. Paul's reference to love was a change from typical Stoic teaching. Although both Jesus and Paul were well aware of the Stoic tradition and occasionally used that philosophical language to speak to people in a way they could understand, Christian faith is not simply a form of Stoicism. Some of its teachings do overlap with Christian faith. But in fact, Jesus lived his life with passion, which went against the grain of Stoicism. He loved us so deeply and suffered so deeply that the defining week in his life is known as Passion Week when we recall the story of Jesus' death and resurrection. It's okay to embody passion as an expression of our love for others. Jesus lived his life to free us from the weight of feeling condemned, from feeling excluded from community, from being defined only by how we fall short. Paul's early life was defined by harshly enforcing strict laws and by hunting down and rounding up those who violated them. His entire life was turned upside down and transformed when Jesus intercepted him on the road to Damascus and showed him another way to live. Paul later saw how dark and oppressive his previous life had been. He embraced love and forgiveness and the freedom we find in a gracious and loving God who welcomes you and me and every neighbor, stranger, and foreigner. The life of freedom in the gospel and in the Spirit looks like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These are positive expressions of freedom. This is what the life of faith looks like. This is what builds up community and one another. May God's Spirit always guide us in these practices and help us to forge a new way in our life together. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.